Hello, and welcome to this session on adaptations in the classroom, focusing on a case study of an AHRC-funded project called Transforming Middlemarch. I'm Justin Smith, and I'm Professor of Cinema and Television History at De Montfort University.
And I'm Lucy Hobbs, and my background is in educational publishing and the study of adaptations. As the postdoc researcher on the Transforming Middlemarch project, I helped to devise the edition, code the 3 texts, and research production materials that we included. And I'm now researching how adaptations could best bring learning benefits to Key Stage 3.
So in this session, we're going to be talking about introducing a 19th century text year 9 and giving a flavour of how we can study a text in detail as part of a 19th century literature or Shakespeare project involving sample extracts and visual approaches as recommended in Joe Heathcote's recent book, Enriching English Curriculum with Soul. There's a number of benefits, of course, to doing such work, an expansion of students' inherent visual literacy skills that lends itself when using adaptation to teach a 19th century text. It's a way of diversifying set texts and engaging a whole class. We might consider the examples here on screen of the 2019 Armando Iannucci adaptation of David Copperfield, with Dev Patel in the title role and Rosalind Elizagare as Agnes Whitfield, which helped to focus David Copperfield's journey in developing his identity, not solely as a novel of education. This can also be a way of seeding the idea of intertextuality and how this works in adaptations, particularly in our example, where we're also working with scripts. And that's equally true of some quite challenging recent period adaptations, such as Stephen Wright's radical A Christmas Carol with Guy Pearce in the title role. And finally, perhaps it's an opportunity to introduce what performance can add to the understanding of a text. So, why Middlemarch? Why did we begin here? Well, Middlemarch was a watershed adaptation for the BBC when it was first broadcast in 1994, at a time when the BBC were uncertain about the future of classic drama adaptations on television. It proved to be, of course, extremely successful. Its screenwriter, Andrew Davies, went on to adapt a whole raft of classic novels for television. And this example was particularly strong for us at De Montfort University, where Andrew Davies' archive is held, and our research team had access to not only a full set of his scripts, but also a range of correspondence and other materials, which enables some very fruitful work to be done in relation to George Eliot's source novel. So, of course, we're not suggesting for a moment that Middlemarch, a heavyweight novel, should be prescribed to read from front to back by year 9s in this example. But what we do want to do is to use the project that we've devised around Middlemarch to select just one scene from the dramatisation, from our genetic edition, and to explore some of the ways in which it might be used productively in the classroom to use adaptation as a gateway to accessing the set text itself. So, before we go into the genetic edition itself, it's worth mapping what it consists of. I mentioned the scripts that we have in the archive, and the genetic edition is essentially three intertextual layers: the source text, George Eliot's novel, Andrew Davies' shooting script, much of which is annotated in his own hand, and finally the post-production script, or the transmission script, which is effectively a transcript of the dramatisation as broadcast. Now, Lucy's going to take you into the genetic edition, but for the purposes of the scene that we're going to explore, you can follow that link at your leisure. Click on scene 121 and you'll be able to access the script, the scene itself as broadcast, by going to note 68 and clicking on the camera icon. But for now, over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Justin. So no, yes, this is the opening screen then of the Transforming Middlemarch Genetic Edition on the website from the link that we had on the previous slide. And just to mention that when you come into the edition on this opening screen, you'll see that there's a short video tour indicated here, which gives a good sort of walkthrough and shows how you can work your way around the edition and navigate through the three texts. We're not going to do that now. We're going to enter the edition and we're going to go straight to scene 121 rather, which is the breakfast scene at the Vincey household. The Vinceys being one of just two nuclear families that inhabit the novel, along with the Garths in their more rural setting. Andrew Davies introduces the Vinceys here first in their domestic setting of the breakfast room, and it's the first time that we get to meet the siblings, Fred and Rosamond, and their mother. Vinceys, as we probably know, are the new money in town, with Mr. Vincey about to become the mayor of Middlemarch. So we've navigated successfully to the start of the scene, and I'm going to first take a look at the fact that Andrew Davies chooses to simplify the Vincey family in this scene. The TV audience only ever meet or hear about the elder siblings and the parents. But as we know from the novel, and this link, this arrow here, takes us straight to the equivalent link in the novel in chapter 11, where we hear that the second son, Bob, has already gone to the warehouse with his father. He's actually going to be taking part in the family business, the ribbon making business. And while the younger girls are in a room with their governess and they've started their lessons, we don't get to meet those in the adaptation. So it's a form of simplification. Going a little bit further down here, there's a note looking at the dialogue and the way that Andrew Davies has adapted dialogue. So Rosamond says that she'll never marry anyone like Fred, anyone who likes to eat red herrings for breakfast, or indeed anyone from Middlemarch. And if we go to the equivalent note over here, it tells us that in the novel, she said something very similar, but obviously Andrew Davies has edited it down considerably. I won't marry anyone from Middlemarch. And a further link in the novel tells us that George Eliot's narrator here talks about Rosamond's aspirations and how she would very much like to leave Middlemarch and its parochial ways. This last link on the same note takes us to where Andrew Davies has made this piece of dialogue even pithier. I'm not marrying anyone like Fred, not to anyone who has red herrings, and not to anyone at all from Middlemarch. So that gives us the full picture of how that dialogue came out of the novel and into the script. A little bit further down, we have an indication of the kind of banter that's going to start between Rosamond and Fred. And this is where Andrew Davies puts his kind of EastEnders spin on the scene. Fred immediately rubs his sister up the wrong way by calling her Rosie, which is obviously her childhood name, and she prefers these days to be called Rosamond. And that's an indication of how they're going to carry on sort of bickering over the breakfast table. So there are three very different ways in which Andrew Davies has sort of chosen to adapt that scene. Moving back up to the top of the scene, we always try, and we've tried to, and we have assembled a really rich stream of production resources around these key scenes that we've chosen to make notes in detail on. So, for example, here we've assembled from Stanford some very interesting notes from Brian Tufano. This comes from the BBC Education Pack, this particular one, where he talks about how he chose to light the property in Stanford where this scene was shot. Then we have the lighting plan that goes with that to show students and to make that come to life. And then we have a photograph of exactly how they did that using these giant scissor lifts outside the property. And that's a photo from the Stanford, from John Smith, the curator of Stanford Museum. You'll also see here the camera icon that we mentioned earlier, and each of these key scenes, like the breakfast scene at the Vincy household, is supported by a clip from the BBC 1994 production. In this case, Andrew Davies has edited down a whole chapter to a scene that lasts 2.5 minutes, and that is easily viewable via the link that we've provided. So that's a quick resume of how the edition works, just looking at one very short scene. I'll hand back to Justin.
Thank you, Lucy. So what we want to do from that introduction to the scene is demonstrate some of the ways we might use this material in the classroom, and we've devised some activities that you could use around this Vincy breakfast scene, showing how the adaptation can engage students with the novel itself. So Lucy's now going to share with you the lesson plan, and we'll talk through some of the activities we've developed.
Right, so this is the lesson plan that we've developed for that scene, and it falls into sort of a 3-part lesson plan. Start of all, looking at the kind of objectives that we'd be able to reach with the activities that we've devised here. Obviously, all the core skills for GCSE language and literature work, looking at language, looking at contextual material, looking at character and theme, for example. So we have a short scene setting, explanation, talking about where we are in the novel, where we are in the adaptation, some starting points, some starter activities, which we'll come back to in a moment, talk about in a bit more detail, because the idea is that these will look at aspects of the text that would be perhaps best addressed at different times in the student's reading journey through the novel, or through any text, not just Middlemarch, through the novel that they're studying. Then some main activities, looking at some of the key areas that we highlighted as being points at which would particularly help students understand the novel through the adaptation in that early slide. Obviously, we've also got some extensions and a writing activity. We like to focus on the language, which the scripts in particular really help students to do, looking at genre, the genre of the script as well as the novel. Intertextuality, an idea there for another breakfast scene from more recent work, Horace Ove's Pressure, where a family meet around a breakfast table, and then the very necessary glossary of words from Victorian times that students might like to know the meaning of before they start their reading. So Justin, I think you were going to just say a little bit more about, we're going to look at the starting points, the starter activities.
Yes, thanks, Lucy. So as Lucy demonstrated in showing the scene earlier on, we have this scene around a breakfast table with this upwardly mobile middle class family, and one very obvious way, perhaps, once students have watched the scene, and before engaging with the novel itself, we might begin by sharing topics that families might argue or bicker about over breakfast. This is a very human situation. It's a very familiar situation. It's not peculiar to people who lived in the 19th century. Arguments between brothers and sisters over the breakfast table. What are they about? How do parents, carers get involved or not in those disputes? And a good way in might be to note down ideas and then watch this scene as screened in the adaptation as a point of recognition, really. Lucy, did you want to say something about the next point?
Yeah, well, I suppose following on from that a little bit further into the students' familiarity with the novel. Once they reached chapter 11 and they'd read chapter 11, they could perhaps start to focus on character in a bit more detail. So they could be looking at, 3 points that they immediately think characteristics of Rosamond from their first reading of the novel. She makes quite an impression, and certainly through both her own thoughts and words and the narrator's commentary on her. And then obviously the same for Fred and Mrs. Vincey. And then they could watch the scene that we've just explored and find out the kind of ways that Andrew Davies is presenting those characters. Is it different? What's different about Fred and Rosie in the adaptation? What kind of mum is Mrs. Vincey? And this will help them sort of get their sort of solidify their first impressions of the characters from the novel.
And then when the scene has been read, perhaps a different point of entry might be to revisit the chapter and use a viewing of the scene in the dramatisation to explore more broadly some of the key themes in George Eliot's novel. Here, particularly, the significance of social class or rank, where these people are, this family is in provincial society, and the difference between the origins of the parents and the aspirations of their children in terms of their outlook and their social mores, the constraints of that society, the limitations upon what's feasible financially in terms of class mobility, and the frustrations of youthful aspirations for social improvement. These are all broader themes in the novel that could be fleshed out by the work on this key scene. And that's illustrated then through a range of substantive activities, as Lucy's mentioned, that you could go on to explore in the classroom. And this lesson plan will be available on the English Association website after this session. And we welcome very much anybody who trials it receiving feedback via that link as well to see how it works for you. So now we're going to move back to some broader thoughts about adaptation in the classroom, and some of the lessons we learnt from our Transforming Middlemarch project about the craft of screen adaptation. We deciphered in our work a whole range of different kinds of technique that screenwriters like Andrew Davis typically use, and they're listed there. Now, as additional activities in the classroom, there's lots that one could do around some of these particular techniques. For example, there are opportunities for creative writing based upon Andrew Davies' own inventions, the elements of the adaptation that don't appear in the novel, what he adds. There is a lot to explore around the way in which some material is juxtaposed or reordered in the adaptation from the source novel, in terms of learning more about plot and narrative in order to create particular effects. And there's opportunities for drama and performance activity around the structuring of particular scenes in the novel and the way they translate to their on-screen dramatisation. There's also scope for language work too, around the way of the principles of editing, of choosing to leave material out, of condensing material, and so on. Anything to add there, Lucy, in terms of the adaptive techniques of Andrew Davis?
No, but I'd like to draw attention to the script page, which I think is really interesting in terms of they're showing in the left hand column the main changes on this opening page of the episode 2 script that Andrew Davis was going to make. It was going to change the emphasis, for example, of whether to include a horse fair scene that he was initially very keen to include. And on each of these opening pages of the scripts that you can see in the edition, there's this summary of the main changes that he's going to make after consultation with his script editor, Susie Conklin. So, you know, there's lots to glean, lots to show students there about the original screenwriter's thoughts that sort of back up some of these points that we've drawn out for the kind of techniques that he uses.
So we'd like to draw attention finally to the Educational Recordings Agency, which you may well be familiar with, and additional resources that are out there to help support the teaching of adaptations in the classroom. Lucy, over to you.
Yes, I mean, the Educational Recording Agency has this free license, which is funded by the DFEE and is available to every school in the land. And you can simply go onto their website. The link is on that slide. And here you can apply, if you haven't already, you may already be aware of this, apply for your ERA license, which gives access to a whole range of literary adaptations, and also if we just look at, for example, Pride and Prejudice, you can see here there's also a whole range of analysis documents, documentaries and comment programs that have been on the BBC over the years, as well as adaptations from across the decades. So it's a very, very useful and a treasure trove of resources there for you to explore in class with your students, and it's all available freely.
And if we just return to the final slide, um, we'd also like to draw attention here to book we mentioned earlier on in the discussion, Joe Heathcote's Enriching English Curriculum with Soul, which really does offer some valuable ways of using 19th century texts in particular in the classroom. If you'd like to say anything more about that, Lucy.
Yes, I think Joe's book's particularly good at kind of looking at the kind of opening up spaces for introducing key skills prior to GCSE, consolidating those, and also she looks at this through sort of a short project work really, and one of these projects could be, introducing or Shakespeare text and looking at adaptations, introducing, a text like Christmas Carol in year 9, which I know a lot of schools do already, and bringing in other resources to sort of to give that initial flavour of the text before study of it starts in earnest. So it's an excellent short guide really to making the most of any time that is available in year 9 to do that kind of work.
So thanks very much for your attention to this session. We hope that it's been interesting and useful. We do, as I've said, very much welcome your feedback and ideas via the English Association. And we hope that we've modelled some of the ways in which we might think productively about using adaptation resources, both the resources we've created through the Transforming Middlemarch project and indeed some of the ideas that we've generated in the lesson plan to apply to other texts, and that those prove productive ways of thinking about using adaptation to teach 19th century texts in the classroom. Thanks very much for your attention.